Hi there. So what we're going to be doing in this video is we're going to be discussing how to do a ratio analysis. And so the data that I have here open in Excel is income statement and balance sheet data for Target for the last several years, so 2020 through 2025 for the income statement, and then 21 through 25 for the balance sheet. And then we've got a group of ratios that we are going to compute for Target. And I've got 4 different areas that we're going to work with that are shown to you here on the screen. The first area up here in the top left, this provides a set of retail industry averages for us for the same period. Then I'm going to compute Target's ratios here for that period. And then finally, I'm going to use this section to populate data that are needed to compute the ratios. And then last but not least, I'm going to use this section to determine the differences between Target and the retail industry overall. And we'll see where Target's doing better than industry and where Target's doing worse than industry. So that's our agenda. So the first thing I'm going to focus on is I'm going to focus on populating these fields. Okay? And what we're doing in these fields is we're bringing over data to essentially put all of our data in one spot. And so we're going to come over here first to our balance sheet data, and we're going to have to do a little bit of rearranging of our data. And the reason we're going to have to do the rearranging is we had been doing a horizontal and vertical analysis with this data, which necessitated this left to right reverse chronological sequencing, right? 25, 24, so forth, and so on. Looks like I got 2 24s in here, so we'll take one out. All right. So we've got this reverse chronological sequencing shown in here. But what we want now is we want our normal chronological order so we can show our ratios in normal chronological order. So I'm just going to use cut and paste to rearrange this data. So I'm going to click on this column, go to cut, and I'm going to move it over here to G, and I'm going to paste it. And so I just moved the 25 data right here to G, and then I'm going to take 21, move it back to where that 25 data was, and then 24, and so we're just moving them around to put them in order. And so now our data is in order, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25. And I'm going to take the blank field right here and delete it. And so we've just rearranged our data and put it back in that different order. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab the data we need from this balance sheet to populate this section right down here. So we're going to start with the total assets. And we're going to start with a 21 balance sheet. So we're going to come right over here to 21. And we're going to do total assets. And then the total assets for the 21 year is this 51 billion right there. Okay. And then we're going to do total equity. So we're going to come right here, scroll down, and they're calling that total shareholders investment. Same concept though. So we grab that. And then I'm going to skip long-term debt and come to all debt. So we're going to go back to the balance sheet, and we're going to grab the total of liabilities and shareholders' investments, so total of liabilities and equity for Target. And then I'm going to subtract from that the total equity. And then it's going to leave me with just the liabilities. That's because on our balance sheet, we don't have a total liabilities. Now, Target gives us a total current liabilities and a total non-current liabilities, but most companies don't even do that. Most companies just have total current liabilities, list a bunch of liabilities, and then go straight into equity. And so we arrive at the total debt by taking the total liabilities and equity and subtracting the total equity. Then we're going to get current assets. So current assets for 21 are right here. And then current liabilities. And current liabilities for 21 are right there, the 20 billion. And then we're going to get inventory. And inventory is right here, the 10 billion. Okay. And then the next couple are average assets, average inventory. Okay. We're going to come back to those in a few minutes. Net sales, cost of goods sold, and average receivables. We'll come back to those. But what we need to do most of these is we need our data from our income statement. So now I'm going to come back over to the income statement. And our income statement data also needs to be reformatted to put it into the correct order. So I'm going to select this whole column, and I'm going to copy that. Oh, we've got a merged cell in here somewhere. Right there is the merged cell. So I'm going to come right here to Format Cells, Alignment, and I'm going to uncheck the Merge Cell box right there. And that's going to fix that. And now, when I copy this data and paste it in right there, it moves 25 for me. And I've got the same problem, Merge Cell right up here. So we're going to go to Format Cells and Unmerge. We'll do the same thing for 2020. So for 2020, put it on that end. For 24, right there. And we'll get these back in their correct order. And then just like before, we're left with one extra column, which we'll delete. And this 12 months ended, which was the merge cell, we're going to move this back to here. Okay. And then we're going to center it across this entire section. That's another reason to do center across selection rather than merging cells. So it gets at the same center effect. And then there we are. All right, so we've got our income statement reformatted. So let's go back to our ratio page. And on our ratio page, the first ratio we need is net income. And the first field we need, I should say, to calculate ratios is net income. It's going to come right here. Target's calling their net income net earnings. So we're going to grab that. And then we need net sales from the income statement. And then Target has its net sales listed right here, 78 billion for 2020. Oh, and one thing I did wrong, I have the 2020 year for the income statement. I don't have the 2020 year for the balance sheet. Right? So actually, this 3.2 billion right here is for the 2020 year, February 1st of 2020. And then this net sales figure is for the 2020 year as well. So I'm going to take those out real quick. Okay, so we've got those. And then, let's see, cost of goods sold. We need that for 2020 as well. Cost of sales is Target's term for that. And then the ones we're left with are average assets, average inventory, average receivables, and long-term debt. So the first thing we're going to do to start populating this data, I'm going to copy over our net income. Okay? And that's going to automatically bring in the net income for the 21, 22 years. And it also brings in the 24 and 23, 24, and 25 years. And go one more column. There we are. And so I'm going to do the same thing right here. I'm going to copy these over. And notice I've highlighted these last three columns. And now I'm dragging over from this point. Watch what happens when I do that. Number one, it extends my box formation there. And it also updated my years right up here at the top. Okay? If I had just grabbed this last column, it would not have done that. If I just grabbed the last column the first time around, it would have just copied 22. But since I had more than one column and then copied them forward, it went ahead and updated my years because Excel was able to detect that pattern. Now, similarly, I'm going to go ahead and copy net sales and cost of sales over, which will fill those fields in based on the correct data. And then we're going to copy all this data over, which will fill them in based on the years 21 through 25. So now what we're left with is we're left with long-term debt. Okay, so for long-term debt, we're going to go back over to our balance sheet, okay, and we want to look at our total debt. Okay, and Target provides us with an item for long-term debt, essentially this non-current liabilities item. And so we're able just to select that. But most companies don't provide us with a long-term debt item. For most companies, you'll need to come right here, and you'll take the total assets right here minus the total equity and minus the current liabilities, and that will give you the amount of non-current debt. And so, for example, if I were to mirror this calculation right here, and instead of just grabbing this number right here, watch what happens. So total assets minus equity minus current liabilities gives us this exact same number. So you'll notice that these two match. So Target was good enough to give us a total for non-current debt, and so we were able to use that. Most companies won't. And so for most companies, this is the calculation you'll be doing. Total assets minus equity minus current liabilities. And that works because of the accounting equation. So for example, we know under the accounting equations that total assets equal liabilities plus equity. So that means total assets equals total liabilities and equity. And then total liabilities and equity minus equity gives us all debt, all liabilities, and then all liabilities minus current liabilities gives us only the company's long-term debt. And the reason you want to do that type of calculation, rather than just grabbing, say, a long-term debt item, like right here, off of the company's financial statements, is if you just grab an item that says it's long-term debt, you're ignoring other types of long-term liabilities that you want to include in your long-term debt calculation. For example, these non-current operating lease obligations are basically just like any other type of long-term debt. And so we want to include those in the calculation. Same thing with deferred taxes and then the other non-current liabilities. We want to make sure all those get incorporated. All right, so anyway, so that was that process. And so what we've got now, okay, I'm going to just copy this over. And now we've got all that data filled in. Okay, and now we start dealing with our averages. So we have average assets, average inventory, and average receivables that are needed for us to populate various ratios. And so we start calculating averages. And in each case, we're going to use a simple average to do those calculations. And so we're going to use the average formula in Excel to do that. So we'll bring that formula up. Here's our formula. This first one is average assets. So we've got what? Beginning assets and ending assets. I'm sorry, I need to come right over here and then field off. So we've got average assets for end of 21 and end of 22. Average those together. Boom, we have $52 billion. We do the same thing for inventory. The average inventory for the 21 and 22 years is going to be the 10.6 billion and the 13.9 billion. Average together, boom, 12 billion. And then the average receivables come right here, and we're going to find our average receivables. Oh, it looks like I didn't bring receivables over. So we don't have receivables. We'll pop over to the balance sheet right here, and we'll find receivables on the balance sheet. Let's see. Oh, that's because Target doesn't book receivables. They don't actually show receivables, right? So we don't have to worry about that particular item. Now, most businesses do show receivables. Target's case, they're including their receivables as a subset of cash. So for our purposes, we'll ignore that one, and we won't be able to compute receivables for Target. But if you're doing this for another business, you would just take their beginning receivables and their ending receivables and then average them together to make a simple average. And so for Target, we're going to copy these over, and we get that data right there. And what we're now ready to do is we're now ready to compute our ratios for each of the years. So we're going to come right up here, and we're going to go to, say, let's do net profit margin first. We'll do as many of these as we can. We're not going to obviously be able to do 15 through 19, but we'll do some of the later years. And so the net profit margin is simply net income divided by the net sale. Okay, so 0.041 for Target. The gross profit margin, okay, is going to be the, cost of goods sold divided by net sales. Now that's not the gross profit margin. That's our cost of goods sold margin. And that's going to come up to 0.70. And then I'm going to come right in here, and I'm going to add -1. Because remember that the inverse of gross margin, okay, is the cost of goods sold margin. Okay? So that's going to become this 0.29, which becomes our gross profit margin. Let's see if we can compute any of these for 2020 year. I think that's all we can compute for the 2020 year. But we can now calculate these two by dragging them all the way over, and suddenly they calculate an update for each year. And you'll notice Excel is deriving each set of data from the correct fields that we would expect for each year, which is the significance of us having filled in this table right down here before we started calculating ratios. Now we want to look at our return on assets ratio. So our return on assets ratio, beginning with the 21 year, is going to be the net income divided by the total assets. Okay, so 0.08%. And then return on equity, right, return on equity is going to be our, that's going to be our net income divided by the total equity. So let's say net income right here divided by total equity right there. Return on equity is 0.30. Our long-term debt divided by our equity, right? So that long-term debt divided by equity ratio, the so-called debt to equity ratio, that's going to simply be exactly what it sounds like. So that's going to be our long-term debt, which we have right here, divided by our equity, 1.15. Our total debt to equity ratio is going to be the all debt, the 36 billion, divided by equity of 14 billion, so 2.54. Our debt to asset ratio is going to be the total amount of debt divided by the total amount of assets. So that's essentially the percentage of our assets that are financed by equity, or by debt rather, so 71%. Our current ratio is going to be our current assets right here divided by our current liabilities here, so 1.03. Our quick ratio is going to be our current assets right here minus our inventory right there, the 10 billion. So that's our quick assets, right? So current assets minus inventory, and then we're going to divide that into current liabilities and get 0.50. And then our asset turnover, let's see, we can't compute for 21 because we don't have average assets. So the rest of these are going to be duds for the 21 year. But if I take each of these now and copy them forward, the data will update year by year by year. Okay? And then we're going to start with asset turnover. In the first year, we have the average assets. Okay? And our average assets, our asset turnover is just going to be our net sales divided into the average assets. So we're going to take right here, net sales, 106 billion, divided by the average assets, 52 billion. So asset turnover of 2.01. And then inventory turnover is going to be cost of goods sold divided by the average inventory of 12 billion, 6.10. And then again, Target doesn't track receivables, so we're not able to get receivables data off the face of their financial statements. But if we did have receivables data, our calculation for receivables turnover would just be sales divided into the average accounts receivable. So it would be essentially that divided by the average receivables. And that's going to come up as divide by 0 because we don't have an amount for the average receivables in this particular exercise, just because of the company that we're working with. And we're going to take each of these and we're going to copy them over. Okay, so come up right up here. Oops. Highlight those 3, copy them over to the right. Right, and you'll notice we get those data points. Now, in terms of determining trend analysis, we can start to do some basic trend analysis, and there are 2 really good ways to visualize trend analysis of these ratios in Excel. The first option is to add some spark lines. So I'm going to come right over here to the Insert tab, and then the Spark Lines section, and then I'm going to go right there and highlight beside all those, and I'm going to click right here on Line. Oh, sorry, I got to do line. So line, and then this is going to be my line right here. And so what we can see is here's a line essentially tracing this ratio, right? Okay, 0.29, 0.29, 0.29, a big dip to 0.24, back up to 0.27, and then up to 0.28. And if I take that field now and I copy it down, we're going to get the data for each subsequent year. Right? And what you'll notice is beginning right here, where we only have the data for 21 forward because of the differences in the financial statements we had, okay, you'll notice that there's a little blank section here at the very beginning indicating a gap comparing this data to this data. And then down here for these 2 ratios, asset turnover and inventory turnover, it's an even bigger blank space because it represents what? 2 years worth of gap, because we needed 2 balance sheets before we could first construct our first year's average inventory and average assets to allow us to calculate our asset and inventory turnover. So these give us kind of our overall directional analysis. The other thing that I like to do is just to come right here and highlight the whole section there, and then go to conditional formatting and color scales, and then let's see, and then we come right here and we can select either of these first 2 depending on what we want to go with. I'm going to go with the green, yellow, red. And that's going to cause the best numbers in profit margin to appear here in shades of green, the worst number to appear here in red, and then the middle of the road numbers to appear in kind of shades of yellow. And so 2020 through 22 was a good time for Target for profit margin. 23 was a low point, and things have gotten a little bit better since then and are almost back to where they were right in here, right? The difference between, say, 21 and 22 and 25 is pretty small, but it's still there. And then I'm going to do the same thing on this next one. I'm going to come right here, like that first one. And so it shows us on profit margin, same story. But on profit margin, the story's a little different, right? The worst year is the same. The best year is different. And most years we see target hovering what? Right around this 4%. And then we can just do the same thing for all of our other ratios. And notice if we include a year where there's no data, it just doesn't do anything in terms of that. So it's clearly showing us what? Visually, our best years and our worst years, right? 22 was a really good year, okay? But 23 was an awful year. And then 21 and 24 are about the same color, so they're both kind of middle of the road. Worst year, 25. And you can do that for each one of our ratios, just like that. And so that provides a basic beginning point for the analysis. Now, one thing you have to be careful about, watch what happens if I try to do more than one row at a time. If I try to do, say, that these last 4 rows collectively, it doesn't work. And the reason it doesn't work is because it's now scoring these last 20 fields, all the 20 highlighted fields together. And so since those 20 fields don't actually rank together and don't actually relate to each other, it's not particularly useful for us. So I'm going to undo that, and I'm going to go back to doing just one row at a time. And then we're going to come right here, conditional formatting, scales, and so we can keep seeing kind of the effect of each year shown to us visually. And notice we're not even really having to look at the numbers, right? We're just looking at the colors, right? And so we're going to know when we finish this exercise, so what year of all these years looks like it was the best year for Target? It's going to be 22, right? The year they had the most green and yellow and no red at all, right? But 23 is also going to be its worst year, where they have what? The most red, even though they still got some green, right? The operations that year are struggling right here, but the financial performance of the business was still pretty good. That was a great year for financial performance of the business, but operationally, Target wasn't doing so great in that period. And so now what we've constructed is we've constructed essentially a model that allows us to think about Target's ratio analysis. Now the next step we're going to do is we're going to compare this to our retail industry average numbers. Okay? And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to calculate the variance in this field right over here between Target and the overall retail industry. Okay? And so we see the retail industry 2020 gross profit margin was 30%. And we're going to take Target minus the retail industry. And what we see is we essentially see that Target is at the industry average. Now, if we add a few more decimal places, we see they're just below the industry average. Okay? And I'm going to remove that formatting right there so we don't have that. Okay? But let's then do the same thing for all of our other ratios. I'm just going to copy that field down, and then now we've got what? A comparison for Target all the way down. The receivables turnover one is not significant because we don't have a receivables turnover for Target. And actually, these aren't significant because we don't have any of these items for the 2020 years. The only ones we've got are going to be the 2 gross profit and net margin ratios. Then for the 21 year, we'll do the same thing. So for 21 year, we're going to take Target, gross profit margin of 0.29, minus the overall industry performance of 0.35. So Target is what? 0.6 off from the industry. And then I'm going to clear that conditional formatting that pulled over from there because that's not relevant to this data set. And then I'm going to copy this data all the way down. And then as we look at this particular business, we look at Target, we can see how they're performing. And I can now take say, all this data and add a new set of data for the 21 year, a new set of visual analytics. And what do we see? Well, the high point for Target that year was the debt to equity ratio. Okay? The low point for Target for that year was its inventory turnover ratio, which had a significant deviation from the industry average for that year. Okay? Now we still need to do our same analysis for 22 through 24, and what I would do is I'll add some more fields right here, and then I'm going to highlight these 3 fields, grab this bottom corner and drag it out, and it's going to automatically populate with that data. So notice 22, 23, 24, 25 are all automatically going to populate. And then if we had the industry average data for these years, we would just populate them right up here. But we don't actually have those, so we're not able to do that, unfortunately. Okay? But the overall thrust is we get a good understanding of our data. And then what we want to watch is what's our trend. Right? So Target's profit margin, for example, is trending what? The gross profit margin is trending worse, a little bit worse than the industry. And the deviation from the industry is what? Growing. Right? 2020, we were almost exactly on industry. They were off by what? 0.0024. Okay, compared to that. 0.21, though, they were off by what? They were off by a full, 6 points, 6%. Ouch. That's a big hit, right? And the industry, what? Got better in 21, and Target, what? Got a lot worse. And so we'd monitor that change over time and see essentially what was happening for that business as it continued to grow.